Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy and has for many years. My co-host, Richard Ebeling, is over at the Citadel grading papers and doing that sort of thing that comes with being an economics professor at that college. So you get a solo performance by me this week. And given that it's Christmas time, I thought that we would engage in a thought experiment. Okay, imagine the following scenario. That some 90 years ago, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, and he adopted the New Deal revolution in America, which converted America's economic system to what we know as a welfare state. Suppose that as part of that New Deal welfare state society, Roosevelt had mandated that everyone would be required in families to give other family members a present at Christmas time. And the idea would be that giving presents is important at Christmas time and that children should be taught that this is a good thing to do. And not only for parents to be buying children presents, but also for children to be buying parents presents or to buy other siblings presents. And so let's imagine that Roosevelt issued a decree mandating that everyone within the immediate family was required to give everyone else a present. Now, at that time, things were pretty bad. It was the Great Depression, and so let's just assume hypothetically that the amount was going to be $1. And maybe for children it would be 50 cents since they don't have as much money as their parents do. But in any event, everyone would be required to give this present at Christmas time. And then as the decades went on and the Federal Reserve was debauching the currency and the value of the dollar was dropping, let's assume that the amount of the gift went up, the mandatory gift went up to, let's say today, of $25 for parents and $10 for children. And that this had been going on all our entire lives. I mean, all of us have been born and raised under this system of mandatory gift giving. Now, suppose then that somebody comes along, a libertarian, let's say it's me, and I raise an objection to this system. And I say, maybe it would be good to have a system where this is all voluntary, where people give gifts on just a purely voluntary basis. Now, you can imagine the uproar that would produce, because remember, we're all living under this system. We've all been born and raised under it. We've become dependent on it. And so the uproar would be tremendous. It would be, Jacob, what's wrong with you? Do you hate Christmas or what? And I'd say, well, no, I just think that maybe gift giving at Christmas time ought to be on a purely voluntary basis instead of mandated. Oh, I probably should add that anybody who fails or refuses to comply with this mandate would be subject to a misdemeanor offense with a maximum of a year in jail and a $10,000 fine. And so my argument would be, well, look, let's just make it voluntary. Let's get rid of this law entirely. And I mean, you can imagine how people would get so upset. Many people would, that, you hate Christmas and you're against care and compassion and love. I mean, because we all know that, when you buy a gift, it sort of expresses a love for the other person. You're being kind, considerate. It's a joyful time. And so, people would say, what are you trying to do, Jacob? Take the joy out of Christmas? And we all know, Jacob, that if people aren't mandated to give gifts, not every family is going to be giving gifts. And so the law ensures that most everybody is going to be giving gifts. And those that don't, well, okay, so they have to spend a year in jail. What's the problem with that? They made their bed and they could sleep in it. And again, I would say, well, I think most parents would continue buying gifts for their children. I'm not sure whether children would be buying gifts for their parents without this law, or maybe some kids would be buying gifts for their siblings, or maybe not. But why not just make this voluntary? Let each family make this decision. Oh, Jacob, you're just so pie in the sky. You're just trying to ruin Christmas. Here we have everybody giving gifts, and it's a joyful time, and everybody likes giving gifts, and we've all become dependent on this system. And so that would be the answer. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the welfare state is this mindset of dependency that it creates. That when you're born and raised under a particular system, you start thinking that you couldn't survive without the system. That a system where people are free to make these decisions is a system that it just wouldn't work. Because of this mindset of dependency. I mean, we see this all across the board on the welfare state, on Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, public housing, corporate bailouts, foreign aid. Every program where the government, through the IRS, seizes a portion of people's income in order to give it to other people. And the idea is that if you ever question the legitimacy of any of this, it's like, oh, well, you hate the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. And we all know that without this, people would be selfish and they wouldn't care for others on a voluntary basis. And yet, America lived without a welfare state for more than 100 years. It's remarkable, really, how different our American ancestors believed with respect to what freedom really means as compared to today's Americans. Now, we know there were some bad founding principles of this country, no question about that, slavery, women's rights, and so forth. But in terms of economic liberty for most people in society, it really is a truly remarkable, unique society. None has ever existed like this in history. If you take, for example, the post-Civil War era, let's take 1870 to about 1915, this was clearly the most unusual way of life that mankind has ever seen. Imagine no taxation on income at all. People were free to keep everything they earned. There was nothing the government could do about it. You didn't have to keep track of deductions or run to the post office on April 15th to get your tax return filed. You didn't have to worry about IRS audits. None of that. You made it, you kept it. And there was also sound money. The official money of the United States that had been established by the Constitution was gold and silver coins. And the Constitution's clear about this, that the federal government's got the power to coin money, but not the power to print money. And then there's also that provision that is a restriction on the states. No state shall make anything but gold and silver legal tender. Of course, it's violated with impunity today. Without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment, the Roosevelt administration converted America's monetary system, which had been in existence for more than a century, into a paper money standard where the paper money promises to pay nothing. And, of course, confiscated or nationalized everyone's gold. There was open immigration. It was an amazing system. Anyone could come here from anywhere in the world. Virtually no questions asked. And they did. They flooded into American shores. They wanted part of this system where people could keep everything they earned. And there was no drug war. And there was no welfare state. There was no Social Security. There was no Medicare. There was no food stamps, public housing, assistance to the poor, assistance to corporations. None of that. In other words, giving and care and compassion, charity was entirely voluntary. And interestingly enough, in the late 1800s, there was the biggest increase in the standard of living that mankind had ever seen. In one 20-year period or 30-year period in that time period, the workers' salaries doubled in value. Not because of inflation, because there was no inflation, because there was no Federal Reserve System to be printing money there. That didn't happen until 1913. So when the real wages doubled, that meant that your money now bought twice as much as it did before. And then it doubled again in this period between around 1870 to around 1915 or so. It's incredible. Inventions were coming into existence practically on a daily basis. So people's standard of living was increasing, notwithstanding the fact that thousands of penniless immigrants were flooding into America, or maybe because of the fact that thousands of penniless immigrants were flooding into America, including in New York City, where things were pretty crowded back then too. So it's a remarkable period of time. So when people say, oh, Jacob, if we didn't have these welfare state programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, corporate bailouts, and the like, America would fall into the ocean, and there'd be people dying in the streets, and there'd be starvation and revolution. And so this is nonsense, because that's exactly what America was like without a welfare state. And the interesting part is it turned out to be the most prosperous and the most charitable nation mankind had ever seen. When people were free to accumulate wealth, they gave it away. This is how the hospitals got built, the museums, the opera houses, the charitable foundations, and so forth. When people were free to accumulate wealth, they used part of it, a large part of it, to give it away, to help others in need. But by the same token, those that were saving their income, it was going into banks, and then the banks were lending it out as capital for businesses. Businesses were buying equipment with it, new tractors and so forth, which was increasing the productivity of the workers. And when the productivity increased, then the revenue to the owner of the business increased, which thereby meant that they had more money to pay higher wages. It was the only way wages could rise, is if the owner acquired increased revenues from increased production. And how did that come about? Did they have to depend on the benevolence of the owner? No, through the competitive process. If an owner wouldn't match what his competitor down the street was willing to pay his workers, he'd lose his workers. So through the process of competition, this is what was causing wages to rise. And so Americans really did discover the key to ending poverty. I mean, that's one of the things that we often forget, that Americans showed, they demonstrated that this was the way to end poverty. This was the key. This is one of the age-old problems that societies have always faced. Mass poverty, mass starvation. Before America came into existence, back in the Middle Ages and so forth, I mean, people had very short lifespans. But then by the time the early 1900s comes along, the late 1800s, lifespans are extended tremendously. And a large part of this is because Americans had discovered the key to ending poverty. And that's the massive accumulation of capital that makes people more productive. So then we end up with this massive welfare state. We get the income tax in 1913. We get the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. That enables them to start printing the money. So those two things really set the stage for the welfare state revolution in the 30s. That once the Great Depression came along, President Roosevelt used that as the excuse to convert America to a welfare state. And of course, a welfare state's expensive. I mean, because you're taking money from people now. Now people have less money to save, less productive capital, and so your standard of living is not going to grow as high, and it could even fall, depending on how much the government is seizing through the IRS. And of course, the whole idea is, they're helping the poor, but actually they're doing the exact opposite. Short term, yeah, I mean, it looks like, oh, wow, poor people, the seniors, the elderly, they're really benefiting from this welfare state system. But as time goes on, the amount of productive capital is now being limited by the government's seizure and confiscation and redistribution of all this wealth. And that, of course, impedes the growth process. You've got the Federal Reserve as part of this, because they're just printing the money up. If you look at the value of the dollar from the time Roosevelt nationalized gold, imagine, nationalized gold. This has been the official money under the Constitution for more than 100 years. He nationalizes it without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. I mean, that was the whole idea of the Constitution, that it sets the system, and if you want to change the system, you got to get an amendment to change the system. Not with Roosevelt. I mean, his position was an emergency gives him dictatorial powers. And in fact, when he issued that order to nationalize gold, and he mandated every American to turn in what had been the official money of the United States for more than 100 years, gold coins. And if they didn't do it, he said, I will come after you with a felony offense. This is by decree. I mean, this is the same type of thing that was going on in Mussolini's Italy. And so by with the Federal Reserve starting to print money, once the Roosevelt changed it to a paper money system, that was just an additional tax. And they would pay money to pay for the ever-growing expenses of the welfare state. And so, obviously, that would impede the growth of capital, makes people's money less valuable, and distorts the economy with booms and busts, as we've seen. And the result is what we have today: out-of-control federal spending, out-of-control debt. I think the national debt, the government's debt, is now $31 trillion and growing exponentially. And then you've got now all these machinations with the Federal Reserve, where they're trying to figure out how high to raise interest rates. And the reason they're so concerned, you see, is because they know the truth about what caused the Great Depression. It was the Federal Reserve. Yes, I know we're all taught in our public government schools that, oh no, it was the failure of free enterprise, Jacob, but it's a lie. And Milton Friedman, the libertarian economist, could demonstrate it was a lie. The Austrian school demonstrated it was a lie. The Austrian School of Economics. It was because the Federal Reserve was engaged in its interest rate machinations in the 1920s. And when they started to panic, they had printed too many notes, and they sensed that people were going to start putting runs on the banks to go get their gold coins out and redeeming these paper notes. They panicked and they over-contracted. They raised interest rates too high. That's what brought the stock market crash. But they had to say it was the failure of America's free enterprise system instead of the failure of the Federal Reserve, which is really just a socialist institution, because people would have been furious. I mean, people had lost their entire businesses. My grandfather in Texas, my dad told me that he owned the second largest insurance agency in Texas, and one day he came home and my dad said his face was white as a sheet. He says, I just sold the business for nothing. He had lost everything. And there were people committing suicide on Wall Street. And if people had known the truth, that this was what the Federal Reserve had done and not the failure of America's free enterprise system, there's no telling what would have happened. People would have been furious had they known that the government had caused this thing. So you've got that aspect of it. So today, we've all been born and raised under a welfare state, and so the notion of dismantling the welfare state, which is really what we should do. I mean, this is a socialist system. I mean, there's no other way to say it. We all know that socialism has proven to be the bane of mankind. The socialist principle, or one of the principles, is from each according to his ability to each according to his need, which means the government seizes money from people who have it in order to give it to people who the government says need it more. And that's what the whole welfare state is, taking money from those who have it in order to give it to those who need it. And it's all based on this notion of care and compassion. If you object to it, it means you hate the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. That's what the people on the left say. If you object to public housing or government food stamps or whatever, you hate the poor. That there's no other way to explain your opposition to these welfare state socialist programs. It's just a ploy, of course, but it's an effective one. And with Social Security, we're all taught that if we ended this program, that people would be dying in the streets. It's ridiculous. It's that we've lost our faith and freedom, because we've all been born and raised. It's like the mandated Christmas gifts hypothetical. That if we'd grown up in that system, we couldn't imagine, people being free at Christmas time to decide gift giving. And so it's that mindset of dependency. Same thing with Medicare and Medicaid. It's, you hate seniors, and you hate this, and people would be dying of illnesses and so forth if the government weren't providing this. Well, America lived without Medicare for more than 100 years, maybe 150 years or so. We had the finest healthcare system in history. I mean, it was amazing. When I was a kid, before Medicare, I grew up in the poorest city in the United States, Laredo, Texas, per capita income, and doctors' offices were filled every day. And most of them couldn't pay, and the doctors knew it. They never turned away anyone. Same with the hospital, Mercy Hospital in Laredo. That they relied on donations to subsidize their work, and it all worked. And doctors were still among the wealthiest people in town, second only to the oil people, because they made money from people who could pay. But they felt it was just their ethical and moral duty to give back to the poor and and perform these medical services for free. That's what we need to recapture. But it's very difficult to recapture once you've been born and raised under a system like the mandated Christmas gift hypothetical, that if we'd been born and raised under that system, oh my gosh, people would be up in arms to suggest that it should be ended. So what we really need to do is recapture a faith in freedom, a faith in ourselves, a faith in others, and for many of us, a faith in God, rather than this faith in the coercive apparatus of Caesar. Now, there's also the warfare state to consider, or what we call the national security state. That conversion came after World War II. We started out as a limited government republic, where the federal government's powers were very few, very limited to those enumerated in the Constitution. But they converted the federal government to a national security state, without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. And so we get the Pentagon, the vast military-industrial complex, this army of voracious defense contractors that feed at the public trough, and the CIA with its omnipotent powers of assassination and torture, including of American citizens, indefinite detention. We get the NSA, mass secret surveillance. I mean, all of this is found in totalitarian countries. I mean, China's a national security state. North Korea is a national security state. Russia, Cuba, and post-World War II, the United States. And that's where we get all these foreign interventions. The idea was the communists are coming to get us, the Reds are coming to get us, the Russians are coming to get us, the Chinese are coming to get us, the Cubans are coming to get us. Everybody's coming to get us, as long as they're red, as long as they're communists. That was the big fear. I mean, and they told President Truman, who brought the national security state into existence, again without a semblance of a constitutional amendment, that in order to get this thing, you got to scare the hell out of the American people. Because that's the core of the realm of a national security state, is fear. You got to keep people afraid. And the big fear was the Reds. The Reds are coming to get us. There was even a movie, The Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And it was just a great big racket. The Russians were never coming. The communists were never coming. I mean, the bigger threat was the adoption of socialism by Americans themselves. I mean, you didn't need the communists to come and bring socialism. Americans were doing a very good job at that with Roosevelt's welfare state way of life. But you get all these foreign wars and interventions, Korean War, the Vietnam War, all without the constitutionally required declaration of war. You see, once the precedent was set by Roosevelt that you don't need to comply with the Constitution, like the nationalization of gold, then they realized people aren't going to do anything about it. So what's the point of obeying the Constitution? The federal judiciary is not going to enforce it, and especially after the conversion to a warfare state, the federal judiciary became too scared of the national security establishment. They're too powerful. They're the most powerful aspect of the federal government today. So you get the Vietnam War, and then you get all these coups and foreign interventions and embargoes and sanctions and forever wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, the war on terrorism, the Patriot Act, just on and on, which just was accelerating not only the out-of-control federal spending and debt and paper money issuance, but also accelerating the destruction of our freedom. I mean, there is no way that anyone can be considered genuinely free under a national security state. And then there's this aspect of it, which kind of relates to the original hypothetical of the Christmas gifts and the dependency on systems like this, that once they get going. We've got here in the United States this whole empire of domestic military bases. I mean, all across the country you see, in practically every state, 1, 2, 3 massive military bases. And the communities are dependent on them. I mean, mentally dependent, psychologically dependent. They live in fear that, oh my gosh, their base is going to get closed. This mindset of dependency. And if you go in there and you say, we need to close these bases, what purpose do they serve? I mean, what are they defending us from? There is no possibility that any nation can invade the United States. None. I mean, one thing about the Ukraine crisis, it has demonstrated that Russia was never a threat to the United States. That's what they were trying to make out to be before they ginned up the crisis in Ukraine with their NATO machinations. Oh, the Russians are this powerful thing. They're trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union and take over Eastern Europe and then conquer Western Europe. And they were, again, playing the fear card. But the downside to ginning up this crisis is demonstrated that it was all fake and false, just like the Cold War racket was. The Russians are not coming to get us. They can't even get Ukraine. And it's the same with the Chinese. The Chinese do not have the remotest military capability of crossing the ocean and invading the United States. And there certainly is no Latin American country or Canada that's got that capability or even interest. So what do we need all these military bases for? Well, it's this mindset of dependency. It's, oh my gosh, Jacob, what are you saying we should? Oh my gosh, Jacob, all these cities would fall into the earth. There'd be earthquakes and so forth. It's ridiculous. I saw this growing up in my hometown of Laredo. We had Laredo Air Force Base growing up. And then one time, I think it was in 72, Richard Nixon had won, and they were going to close some bases, and they were going to close another base in Texas. And somebody reminded Nixon that Laredo had gone Democrat, and this other base, the city where the base closure was going to take place, had gone for him. And he goes, oh, well, then let's just close the one in Laredo. And, I mean, you would not believe the fear in Laredo among officials. Oh, my gosh, this was the end of Laredo. Oh, gosh. And that had been the fear throughout the whole Cold War era, that Laredo might lose its base. It was an air training base. And so they closed the base in Laredo. Well, it may be just a coincidence, but no, Laredo did not fall into the Rio Grande. The exact opposite happened. It may have been total coincidence, I don't know, but Laredo prosperity took off. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, it was just a long string of years and decades with just ever-increasing prosperity in the city, population growth, everything, once they got rid of this air base. One of the interesting aspects, though, was that the federal government did not privatize the base. They transferred it to the city. So the city became the owner of this huge base with all the buildings, and they would rent out the buildings to private owners. My dad used to call it Little Cuba because it was all government owned. And interestingly enough, I was told that in the deed where they transferred the property to the city, the federal government reserved the right to retake the property if they needed to do so in a national emergency without paying any money. So even if the city of Laredo had privatized the base, who's going to build a multi-million-dollar building there knowing that the government could take it without paying any compensation? But in any event, this is what goes on in cities all across America. I mean, these giant military bases that everybody's dependent on. Oh my gosh, we couldn't survive without this base. This is nonsense. These bases are a dead weight on societies that they need to be closed, and it would go a long way if we were to dismantle this empire of domestic military bases. It would go a long way, obviously, to putting our fiscal house in order, considering the out of control federal spending, debt, and monetary debauchery. And it wouldn't have any effect, like I say, on the defense of the country, because what are they defending us from? What's the purpose of these military bases? Nobody even asked that question. What is the purpose of the whole national security state? They're the ones that gin up their own crises. They're the ones that create America's official enemies so that they can then justify their existence and their ever-increasing largesse and their defense contractors feeding at the public trough. That was what the whole Cold War racket was all about. The Reds are coming, the Reds are coming. And then when they lost that official enemy temporarily, they got it back, of course, now that they've ginned up this crisis using NATO to gobble up Warsaw Pact countries and move ever closer to Russia's borders. They knew that Russia was going to respond to that. They knew it because people were telling them that was going to happen, and because Russia was telling them that was going to happen. Notwithstanding that, they kept moving. They kept moving eastward with their missiles and their troops and their bases and so forth. They knew. When Biden says, I have intelligence saying Russia's going to invade Ukraine, that's such a bull. He knew Russia was going to invade because Russia had been telling him that was what they were going to do for some 25 years if they kept moving eastward with this Cold War dinosaur called NATO. And when they lost the Cold War enemy, they go into the Middle East and they start intervening, and they knew that there was going to be terrorist blowback. They knew it because people were telling them, if you keep killing people here in the Middle East with your sanctions and embargoes. Remember, Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the U.S. and UN sanctions was worth it. Imagine, children, worth it. And by it, she meant regime change in Iraq. I mean, how despicable how repugnant can you get? It's horrible, killing children for regime change. And so, they knew that there was going to be blowback. There had been blowback as early as '93 with the attack on the World Trade Center and the attack on the CIA agents outside CIA headquarters. There had been the attack on the USS Cole, the attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, and they were all motivated. People said, we're doing this because of your killing machine. You've got a killing machine here in the Middle East, and you're killing a lot of people. And so people were telling U.S. officials, you need to stop this because there's going to be a major terrorist attack on American soil. And they said, well, we're just going to keep doing it. And so then when the attack comes, oh my gosh, we're shocked, we're shocked. They hate us for our freedom and values. Our killing machine over there has nothing to do with it. It was ridiculous. And then they use that to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, generating a new official enemy, terrorism, which became a perpetual war, the war on terrorism. And now we've gone full circle, where we've got the whole war on terrorism, along with all that destruction of liberty, and now we've got the old Cold War enemies back. Isn't that great? And now they're getting us the same. They're getting us the same thing they got us in '63 or '62. They're getting us perilously close to life-ending, earth-destroying nuclear war. This is no way to live. This is absolutely no way to live. The welfare warfare state has proven to be a disaster. And that's why I keep saying that we need to do some soul searching in this country, serious soul searching. We need to go back to the sound founding principles of our country, and we need to examine what happened here and what were the consequences of the abandonment of those sound founding principles. And if we do that, then I think we've got a heck of a good chance at putting this nation back on the right road and bequeathing to our children's generation, our grandchildren's generation, and future generations of America a really great society, one based on freedom, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. That's my message here for the Libertarian Angle. I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a great holiday season. Again, this is our end-of-year fundraising time. If you haven't yet made a donation to FFF, we'd really appreciate you doing so. Most of the expenditures we have for the coming year, we raise the money here at the end of year. It's not enough. We still get donations during the course of the year, but it's a tremendous assistance to us, and we would greatly appreciate your considering us in your end-of-year giving, and that's the way we advance liberty in this principled way. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye-bye.